you see, though, the interesting truth behind that, which is memory is indeed the mother of artistic invention.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers.
So, Julie, I forget, what are we supposed to be talking about in this podcast?
That is really a great way to start this podcast because, of course, what we're supposed to be talking about is the goodness of memory, something that all of us who are getting older hope that we can retain for a lot longer. Maybe we should be more concerned, Andrew.
Maybe.
Well, I know that this, of course, is something that you talk about in many of your talks, Nurturing Competent Communicators, which you just gave recently at an online conference. You've been doing a lot more online conferences lately.
More than I can count.
Yes. But we got some feedback from one of the participants who happened actually to be a student. She said, "Mr. Pudewa, thank you for sharing your knowledge on communication with us today. I learned a lot through the lecture. I really liked how you said that you cannot speak or write what you do not know. My mom is having my brother and me memorize and recite poetry this semester, so I look forward to applying what I learned to that today. And have a wonderful day." And I think probably her mother maybe had already listened to that talk, Nurturing Competent Communicators, saw the value of it. This is probably a teenager.
Sounds like it to me, and I'm particularly pleased with the correct grammar.
Yeah.
My mother is having my brother and me learn poetry.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people think, well, you always say my brother and I, only in that case, it was the object.
Right.
So it needed to be in the
Objective
accusative or objective case. So
Pronoun, yes.
I thought, well, there's
job,
a student
Annalisa.
who both understands the value of furnishing the mind, which is what I was talking about, as well as having studied enough grammar to get that little nuance correct.
Right, right. So the goodness of memory. What are we talking about today?
Well, I grew up playing music. I was a Suzuki method student, one of the very first in Southern California back in 1964.
Here's some Julie Walker trivia that probably no one knows, unless now they listen to this podcast. They will know this. I, too, played an instrument growing up. Can you guess what it was?
I would think it was some horrible thing like saxophone.
No, but I did.
Flute?
My son did play saxophone. I did not play the
Trumpet?
flute. You'll never guess. I wanted to play the piano. My baby brother got the piano lessons.
Oh.
I learned to play the accordion.
Accordion. Well, that's not bad.
Yeah. No, but it's not a piano. But anyway, yes, memorizing music is a big part of what you do when you're doing a recital.
Well, yes, and one of the distinctives of the Suzuki approach is that the children, if properly nurtured, will retain their memorized repertoire. So it's not like, you learn a piece, you play it a few times for a few people, and then you forget it while you learn a new piece and play that a few times for a few people, and then you forget that while you learn a new piece, and you can continue on for 5 years, and you only know one piece.
Right.
Whereas in Japan,
that one piece not well.
Yeah, in Japan, it was very evident that with little exception, all the students could play all of the pieces that they had ever learned in their whole life. So they built up this huge repertoire of memorized music. And of course, what that does is it furnishes them, it provides for them all the little bits and pieces of musical information that will then inspire and make more effective attempts at improvisation or composition.
Right.
So I grew up doing that, and I remember my mother used to use a particular expression that you don't hear too often today. We might hear people say, oh, you have to memorize. But my mother never said that, and she was a music teacher. She always said, you must learn it by heart.
Mm-hmm.
Learn it by heart. And what does that mean? And that's a whole contemplation right there. Like when you memorize something, whether it's scripture or poetry or an excerpt of a famous speech or dance moves or a martial arts form, it comes into your soul. It's a part of who you are from that time forward. And that's why I think it's so frustrating when we forget things we used to know, because we feel like, I've lost a part of myself there.
Yes.
I remember, I don't remember who said it, but it was some random famous author, basically said, we are the sum total of our memory. If we forgot everything, if we had total amnesia, we wouldn't even know who we are. And so that connection between memory and identity, and then the extension of that into the conscious use of the faculty of memory and the activity of the will in order to inform the memory, are all such fascinating things to contemplate.
Okay. And so I think you just gave us an outline for what we're going to be talking about.
Well, we did a series of podcasts earlier on the 5 Canons of Rhetoric.
Yes.
And we think of those initially as invention, what to say, arrangement, how to order those ideas, elocution, what words, sentences, and devices to use. But then there's also memory and delivery.
Okay.
So that memory is traditionally one of the 5 things that everyone would study and cultivate and grow in the process of learning to write and speak well.
And do you think that's so because so much of the communication was all oral?
Absolutely.
Back in the day, and a lot of people didn't know how to read. So
right. And there's 2 aspects of memory. One is the furnishing of the mind, and we've talked about that in various ways. And the other one are the techniques that you can use to speed up the process of memorization, so that if you want to write a speech and practice it and memorize it and then be able to go give it, there's actually strategies you can use to assist your memory in that. Now, people today do not need this because we have teleprompters.
Well, and you know what? It was only recently, probably within the last 10 years, that I realized that they're using teleprompters. I thought that during the debates or during, the State of the Union address, they had memorized their speeches. And I was so impressed with how smart our presidents are.
Yeah.
And it turns out they're just reading.
Well, and those teleprompters are pretty high tech because they're basically completely transparent on one side. So it just looks, I don't know, like bulletproof glass or something. I'm not sure. But on the other side, they can, see. I remember reading a commentary by an Indian man when President Obama went to India.
Oh, sure.
And he gave a speech and he used a teleprompter, and how people were kind of appalled that he hadn't taken the time, and the care to practice and remember his speech without the aid of technology. But it's a perspective of culture and whatnot.
Well, and, the President of the United States is a very busy man.
Absolutely.
And it takes time to memorize things.
Yeah. Well, so...
And just for the record, listeners, Andrew, as far as I know, has never used a teleprompter. And yet oftentimes when you give talks at conventions, you're just doing it from memory.
Well, yes, but I have the benefit of repetition. And I actually have a system that I use, which I can share.
Oh, good.
I would like to go back to the actual word, however.
Oh,
I think
the word however?
No, the word memory.
Okay.
Because we can learn a lot by the study of the original meanings and the origins of words. So if you look at Greek mythology, there was this goddess named Mnemosyne, and that's actually spelled Mnemosyne.
Link in the show notes.
Mnemosyne, and so it's connected with that weird spelling of the word mnemonic,
Right.
which starts with that MN. And mnemonic, of course, is pertaining to memory. Well, who was this Mnemosyne? Well, first of all, she was the daughter of Uranus and Gaia.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the heavens and the earth.
Okay.
Like, so in the beginning, there was the heavens and the earth,
Right.
and they gave birth to memory.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the first interesting point. But even more fascinating is she was the mother of the muses.
Memory was the mother of the muses.
Exactly. Now, what are the muses? Those were, the gods, so to speak, that inspired the arts. And there were 9 muses, and each of them was responsible for inspiring a different type of art. So when you see, a great ancient epic poem such as the Iliad, and it begins with the words, "Sing, O goddess of the anger of the son of Peleus," blah, blah, blah. Who's that goddess? Well, that's the poet invoking the muse, right, to assist with the creation of art.
Okay.
So when you look at it, outside the context of myth, you see, though, the interesting truth behind that, which is memory is indeed the mother of artistic invention. And it goes back to the comment that teenage girl commented on. You can't get something out of your mind that isn't in there to begin with. We can find things and then put together this unique combination and permutation, and that's our human creativity. But we can't produce something from nothing.
Right.
We need the supernatural for that. And that was the idea of the Greek. So that idea of looking at the reflection of truth and natural order and knowing in the mythology. There is a guy, I don't know much about him except that he was some kind of Italian noble who wrote various poems. And there's really nothing particular about this guy except for the fact that he said one sentence that is still being quoted today.
Okay.
And I'm hoping, if I could say one sentence and people are still talking about it 450 years from now,
Right.
wherever I am at the time, I think would be somewhat satisfying. But I love this sentence. It has been mistakenly attributed to St. Basil the Great, but no. Evidently, it was this guy, Giambattista Basile, who said, "Memory is the cabinet of the imagination, the treasury of reason, the registry of conscience, and the council chamber of thought."
Wow, that's beautiful.
It is. And you think about the imagery here. What do we have? We have a cabinet, a treasury, a registry, and a chamber. So it's as though we have these rooms or containers. And inside those containers are all of the most important human qualities: imagination, reason, conscience, thought.
Say that whole sentence again.
Memory is the cabinet of the imagination, the treasury of reason, the registry of conscience, and the council chamber of thought. And so we see that throughout all of history, people have had a great appreciation for this basic human faculty of memory. In fact, it's very interesting, people talk about technology.
Right.
But what we kind of have to realize is that almost everything humans have created is a technology.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Right? And there's the legend of the king of Egypt and the god Thoth, or Thoth, or Thoth. I don't know how people say it. Thoth. I always said Thoth. And this is told in Plato. So this legend, ancient times, the god Thoth came to the king of Egypt and said, "I will give you this gift of being able to record in writing everything." And the king of Egypt essentially says, well, because you are the great god Thoth, I cannot reject your gift, but this will be a double-edged gift. Because while we will be able to record everything, it will also cause us to forget. In fact, I think I have the actual quote right here, as recorded in Socrates, or Plato, of course. This discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in learners' souls, because they will not use their memories. They will trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves.
Oh my goodness, that is so true.
And so, yeah, because we write it down, we don't have to remember. I mean, we experience this every single day when we make a shopping list.
Right.
Right?
But sometimes the act of writing it down helps to improve.
Oh, yes, and there's all sorts of research about that as well. But I think, these days, particularly in the context of education, we almost need an apologetic for the value of cultivating memory because it's under this double attack. The attack by technology. It will, atrophy the skill that it replaces. If we think, well, I don't need to remember that because I could just ask Siri.
It's true.
Well, then we don't make any effort to remember that. So consequently, kind of our universal ability to retain kind of landmark bits of information that help us then connect new bits of information to previously known bits of information is degraded very significantly.
So true.
And then there's also the corresponding attack by the progressive educationists who say, well, memorizing is tedious. It's uninspiring. It's not creative. It kind of began with Deweyism back in the early 1900s, who, John Dewey, although he said many things that were, true in certain contexts and valuable, he also had a very bad opinion of certain traditional things, one of those being rote learning. Once upon a time, the word rote didn't have a negative connotation. Now it kind of means like painful, mindless, useless.
Exactly. Yep.
But it used to mean if you learned something by rote, you just knew it. You didn't have to think or figure it out or go look for it. You knew it, that was a good thing. But Dewey had that idea that rote learning, at best, is a waste of time. And at worst is, stifling creativity and killing kids' desire to learn and all that.
Well, and I can understand perhaps some of his thinking because we have this term in business called opportunity cost. If you're spending time doing something, you can't spend time doing other things. But in this case, I can give you a real-life example of something that happened to me very recently. I went to visit the town of Charleston, South Carolina, and was in the historic town. We took a lot of tours. I did not know the actual date of when the Civil War began. And yet so much of our country's history is based on that. And if you know where that timeline is, which is 1861, which I now know, 100 years before I was born, it just helps me to pivot so much better. So I feel like I lost opportunity by not knowing that date, more of the richness of our country's history and some of the good and bad things that happened as a result of that significant event that happened on the very grounds of where I was standing in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. It was a very cool thing, and so it was definitely worth me knowing that, which I now know.
Yes, and it's interesting because there's both a continued criticism of teaching kids things like names and dates and what you might just call raw information, versus some of the newer research showing that actually the more you know, the easier it is to learn new things.
Exactly, yep.
And that knowing stuff, in general, is de facto good. It improves reading comprehension. It allows for a more rapid contextualization of new information. And I'm just curious, did you ask Siri, when is the Civil War? When was the American Civil War?
No,
or did you ask Denise?
I did not ask Denise. The tour guide shared it with me, which was really nice because that way I didn't have to show my ignorance to my friend Denise.
I love tour guides because they kind of specialize in remembering and communicating all sorts of interesting things that aren't necessarily vital to your well-being, but enrich your experience wherever you are. So I think we do kind of need this argument in favor of cultivating memory.
Agreed.
So there's various aspects of the biology of memory.
Oh, okay.
We think that, and we talk about our brain and our mind as though most all of the information that we know is stored in our brain. And there's, a lot of evidence. We can see very actively what neurons do. And so when we experience something, when we hear it, see it, or feel it, or when we move our body in a certain way, we're using networks of neurons in certain parts of the brain that through repetition will make connections with each other, right? And through enough repetition, those neurons make, permanent or semi-permanent connections. So we think about the variables there. And I've talked about this before, but there's frequency, or what we might call repetition. And then there's intensity. And then there's duration, which would be persistence over time. So if you kind of, think back to when you were in third grade, if you can't, try fourth.
Okay.
Third grade is particularly fuzzy for me, so I guess that's one reason I always say third grade, because I have so few concrete or specific memories from school in third grade at that time. Now, think about something you can remember from third grade. Now ask yourself, is this something important or something interesting? Most of the time, people will say interesting. Sometimes they'll say important. I remember two things, basically. One thing is I remember learning the multiplication tables.
Okay.
But it did not happen at school. I remember zero of doing math in school. What I do remember is my mom and dad with flashcards teaching me the multiplication tables on the couch at home or even in the bathtub. I remember sitting in the bathtub and my dad would get those multiplication cards and he would, flash them, and I would practice multiplication. And I know I learned it that year because what I wanted more than anything in the world was that super cool Cub Scout knife with all those different blades and functions. And I knew that I had to master multiplication to get that Cub Scout knife. So I was extremely motivated, not because I could care at all about whether 6 times 7 is 42, but because I wanted the thing. So he used a principle of motivation, which we know as contrived relevancy.
Yes. Listen to podcasts on 4 forms of relevancy. Actually, I think we called it
we did
motivation.
a whole series, like 3 podcasts on motivation. And so I remember learning that. The only other memory, I can't remember the teacher or any of the kids. I have virtually no image of the classroom or anything at all, except that I stapled my finger. Now, that's not the significant thing. You could staple your finger and forget it. But what sticks with me is that I said to the teacher, I stapled my finger. And she said, no, you just got a paper cut. And I said, no, I stapled my finger. I know I stapled my finger. She said, no, I think you just got a paper. And to this day, I am outraged by not being believed by the teacher in third grade. And that's all I remember. So why? Why those memories? Well, one is example of repetition.
Right.
Right? And the other is example of intensity.
Yes.
Right?
I think
that
stapling
one
your
memory.
finger.
So if we look back, particularly if we're older and we look back in our childhood, it's very often those things that were done with high repetition or had, a strong memory or something notable to connect with it. And then, of course, duration is reinforcement over time. So if I wanted to teach you something,
Okay.
right? Let's say I just, for some reason, want you to know the Japanese word for toilet.
Okay.
I mean, it might be useful someday. You never know. I could appeal to intensity. I could appeal to frequency or repetition. If I were to do the latter, I'd say, okay, Julie, I've got your office extension, I've got your home phone, I need your cell phone, your husband's cell phone, and any other phone you might possibly be at, because I'm going to call you 5 times every day for the next 7 days and remind you of this little fact, the Japanese word for toilet. Okay. Would you learn this?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, after the 3rd day,
Yes.
you'd be, don't call me anymore. I got it. Okay, I know this. Obenjo. Leave me alone. Okay. So you wouldn't need a full repetition of 35 times in 1 week. However, if there was no reinforcement over time, if there was no extension, then you might forget that in a number of weeks, months, or years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all have this experience. It's called cramming, right? We need to hold this information in our mind long enough to pass a test, and then there's no actual reinforcement use or application. It will disappear.
It's kind of the use it or lose it principle, right?
Yeah. I could also say, Julie, I'm going to tell you this one thing, one time, and you're never going to hear it again, right? But if you don't know this 1 year from now, I will kill you.
Oh.
Or, more effective would be, I'm going to tell you this one time, and you're not going to hear it again for a year, but if you remember this 1 year from now, I'll give you $1 million in gold bullion, tax-free.
I like that.
Actually, the $1 million work better because the fear of death impedes learning.
Yes.
But that would be an appeal to intensity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would be just in your brain, you'd be afraid to go to sleep at night lest you forget this idea.
Mm-hmm.
So you would just constantly hold it in your consciousness because of the intensity. Most effective.
How long do I have to remember this word?
1 year.
1 year, okay. Today is, all right, I'm going to check back with you in a year. Cash in on my gold bullion.
No, it's death. But the most effective would probably be is if I said, I'm going to call you once a week for the next 20 weeks. Because then you're spacing. And Mrs. Ingham with the blended sound-site method, she understood this perfectly. She said the most important thing in learning anything well is spaced repetition. So anyway, that's part of the biology. We'll need to continue this conversation next time.
Yeah.
Because there's more to it. But when we think about, okay, neurons make connections, they reinforce until there are semi-permanent or permanent connections. And then there's reinforcement over time, and there's intensity. So I'm hoping that I will not forget that 6 times 7 is 42 until very close to my ultimate demise. Why? Because I use that fact frequently enough. So those are some thoughts about the biology of how the mind works. We're of course discovering more about the brain every day.
Sure.
And it's very exciting. But when we come back next time, there's some very interesting, almost spooky stories of how very likely we store memories in other parts of our body as well.
Interesting. And will you give us some tricks of how to improve our memory?
Yes, actually, I have 8 ways that you can improve your memory.
Wow.
I don't know that I've utilized them all myself perfectly, but the funny thing is the 8 ways from modern science corresponds pretty much perfectly with Augustine and Aquinas on how to remember things better.
Okay.
So, there's nothing new under the sun.
Okay. So until next week. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcast. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudawa and the team at IEW, I thank you for allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.